10 more knitting tips for beginners and advanced knitters. Hi everyone, my name is Norman, I run the blog nimbleneedles.com and I want you to become a better knitter, and that's why I want to show you 10 more knitting tips and tricks I haven't had the chance to mention in my previous video. So many people commented and watched that video and told me how helpful it was, and I really want to thank you. So I spent the past couple of days going through my old knitting journals and notes, looking for those juicy little tips and tricks that helped me become the knitter that I am today. Because I did realize that this is something that only rarely gets addressed. You will find tons of excellent tutorials here on YouTube that will show you a certain technique. And you will find quite a lot of tutorials that will show you, I don't know, how to turn a binder into a cheap and really smart needle case for your circular knitting needles. But how do you really get better at knitting? What are those little things you can change that will make a huge difference in the long run? So, if you liked my last video, then I'm very sure you will like this video as well, because it's loaded with 10 additional tips. And again, do me a favor, like this video right now to support my work. It really makes a big difference. Or better yet, comment if I was able to help you, or if you have a knitting tip that I didn't mention. And of course, feel free to share this video with your knitting friends online or offline. I'm really sure they will appreciate it. Anyway, let's head over to my desk and I will show you 10 more knitting tips. Knitting tip number 1, knitting neither edges. This was probably the number 1 question I received after my last video. Norman, my edges, they look somewhat weird. How do I make them look neater? Well, there are 2 major reasons why your edges may not look all that pretty. Let me show you. First of all, a normal knit stitch is connected to a stitch on the left and on the right. And these 2 adjacent stitches anchor it. Obviously, for an edge stitch, the second stitch is missing. There is just one to the right or the left side. And that's why the stockinette stitch edge sort of leans towards one side. Even if you're an experienced knitter, and garter stitch will have these little bumps here. And the second reason, because there's nothing to anchor these stitches, every tiny little way you stretch out the stitches as you knit will be twice as bad. Often I see beginners using the stitches as a kind of pivot to get some leverage, and this will stretch out the stitches and create these wonky edges. Here's how to fix that. First of all, work around your knitting needle and only your knitting needle. Don't pull the stitches to the side or upwards, or worse, let your work hang on that single stitch, because this will stretch things out on this row and one row below, and there's nothing you can do to fix that later on. So even I, as a continental knitter, I usually knit like this. But this stretches the stitch out to the right. So for the very first stitch, I revert back to the textbook method and knit it like this. Obviously, I tighten up the stitch after I knit, but if you loosened up the stitch one row below and you knit way and you stretch out those stitches and then you tighten up, what will happen is you will create a very tight stitch followed by a very loose stitch, and this will look even more unbalanced. However, even if you're super careful, your edge still might look like this, so the only true solution is finding a good selvage stitch. Most self-finishing edges involve either slipping the first or the last stitch of a row, so you don't end up knitting that stitch twice, because every time you go through it, there's a chance you may stretch it out. Let me show you. So you knit your row as normal to the end. Be careful with the very last stitch, don't stretch it out too much. Then turn your work around. And now you need to slip that first stitch without knitting. If the rest of your row has purl stitches, then the yarn is held in front.
for the slipping. And if the rest of the row has knit stitches, like in this case, the yarn is held in back, and then you just slip it and continue knitting. And then do the same on this side. So knit all the way to the end. Be careful with that very last stitch so you don't stretch it out. And since this is a purl row, the yarn is held in front, and then you slip that very first stitch and start purling. And if you slip the first stitch of every row, you create this beautiful little edge. And I really like this version, especially for beginners, because you slip the first stitch and you don't end up fiddling around with it. So there's no chance you accidentally stretch it out too much. Now, there are many other ways to create a selvage. This just happens to be the easiest and most versatile. But please comment below if you want me to record a full video on this topic. I already have a video on how to prevent knitting from curling that already addresses a couple of nice selvage options. So I'll link it to you up in here in case you want to watch it. Knitting tip number 2, pass over instead of a decrease. You probably know how to do a standard bind off, and you know how to knit 2 stitches together. What most books and tutorials won't tell you that both result in the exact same stitch. So let's knit 2 together. So knit 2 together. This is how it looks like. Now let's knit 1 stitch, slip it back to the left needle, pass over that stitch and slip it back to the left needle. And as you can see, the result is the same right leaning decrease. Often the passover version looks a bit neater because you don't stretch out the stitches as much. Still, you might ask, why is this important? Well, knit 2 together is often rather easy to knit, but other decreases are much harder. You can do the same for a left leaning decrease. So slip 1 stitch, knit 1 stitch, and then pass over, and the result will be almost an SSK. Why did I pass over the stitch like this? If you want a right leaning decrease, you need to pass over the stitch that is on the left, and if you want a left leaning decrease, like in this case, you need to pass over the stitch that is on the right. I think it's a super helpful technique for a lot of complicated decreases, like purl 2 together through back loop. So you purl 1 stitch through back loop, and then you pass over that stitch, and there is your left leaning purl decrease, and it's much easier to knit. And sometimes you have many decreases next to each other, and even your knit 2 together is difficult, or you are knitting with a very fussy yarn that splits easily. In all of these cases, you can pass over instead of working the decrease the standard way. So it's really helpful. Knitting tip number 3, cheat a bit to enter difficult stitches. Sometimes it's difficult to enter a stitch. A very common example is make 1 left, where you pick up the strand between 2 stitches like this, and then you need to knit it through the back loop. Often your knitting needle will slip past as you try to enter, or you split it, or you can't make it work at all. So in these cases, here is a super simple trick. So I enter my knitting needle through the front loop, and then I use the left needle as a guide and slide my needle past it or around it, and there I am in the back loop, and then I can knit it through the back loop. One more time, so I insert and then I guide my knitting needle around and I knit it through the back loop. And when sometimes even knit 2 together or knit 3 together is very difficult to knit, and in these cases you can loosen up the second stitch a bit like this, and then it will be much easier to knit through together, or mostly this is knit 3 together is even more difficult. So you can loosen up the stitches like this, and then it will be much easier to knit 3 stitches together. Now be careful, don't stretch out the stitches too much, just so much so you can enter. And you can use this technique for any other stitch as well. If it's too difficult to enter, just loosen things up. Knitting tip number 4, tighten up after every stitch. Very often people ask me how I maintain such a nice tension and how my stockinette stitch looks so regular. Well, this is a somewhat difficult topic because it involves just so many factors, but here's one thing I do. So, if you see me knitting, then most people will focus on the stitches. You probably won't focus on my left index finger, and why should you? It's just holding the yarn, isn't it? Well, here's what I do after every stitch. So I insert, pull through, and then my left index finger, I am exaggerating now, will pull the stitch tight. And that way I ensure that all stitches are the exact same size, because the circumference of my right needle will act as a sort of standard measure. So after every stitch, my left index finger will pull the stitch tight. So I knit, and then it's just a tiny little motion. I don't know if you can see it, but every time, and this serves two functions. First of all, it carries more yarn to the front and it tightens up that stitch. So it's a really neat and nice technique for me to maintain an even tension and a very smooth knitting experience. Now I do have to mention two things here. I'm a really tight knitter and I feel comfortable with that. I do try to hold my needles as lightly as possible, but still there are some advantages to knitting loosely as well. So I guess this tip is not for everyone. And of course, this technique sort of really doesn't work if you are an English thrower. In these cases, you would have to learn, flicking to make it work. Knitting tip number 5, unleash the power of lifted stitches. I love lifted stitches, and there is barely a knitting problem you cannot fix with it. You can use a lifted stitch to increase stockinette stitch in a super invisible way by knitting KLL, knit left loop, my favorite increase ever. So you lift this loop onto your left needle and then you knit it through the back loop. So this is the increase. Let me knit a couple of rows across so you can see how it will look. So I knit a couple of rows across, and can you even spot where the increase is? Here it is. So it is just so utterly invisible and I love it. You can also use lifted stitches to knit jogless stripes in the round. So knit one full row in the new color without any special technique. And as you come across the color change, lift that loop here onto the left needle and knit it together with the next stitch. And as we'll see in a second, this will create a super smooth transition. See how perfectly smooth this transition is? There is no jog or step or anything. So really neat. And of course, in my last video, I showed you how to neaten the last stitch of a bind off with a lifted decrease. So if you are interested, I have a full tutorial on how to knit one together right loop and left loop here on my channel. I'll link it to you up in here because there are some stunning things you can do with this decrease. For example, close any sort of holes around a neckline and so on. So it's really worth watching. Knitting tip number 6. When knitting in the round, close the bind off gap by grafting one stitch. So you've probably seen this before. You knit a project in the round, you bound off all stitches, and then there is this ugly little gap here. It looks really terrible, but there's a super easy way to fix it, and it actually feels like magic. So thread the tail on a tapestry needle and then find the very first stitch. See this V here? Go underneath it, pull that tail through, and then find the last bind off stitch. There's a V here as well. Go underneath that coming from the top, pull tight, and then you only need to hide the tail on the back side, weave it in, and see how seamless the transition is. Before it looked terrible and now it looks like you are a magician. Knitting tip number 7. Don't knit complicated stitches as the last stitches on your needle. No matter if you're knitting in the round on double pointed needles or using magic loop, try to avoid knitting complicated stitches into these two last stitches. Because here's the thing, when you're knitting an SSK or knit two together, you often stretch out these stitches quite a bit. And if you do this for the last 2 stitches, there's just so much more yarn they can stretch out. Also, sometimes the whole weight of your work rests on these 2 stitches, stretching them out even further. So don't do this, because here's a really common problem. When you're knitting socks, a lot of people end up here around the gusset where they decrease it. They end up with holes here, and that often is caused by knitting an SSK or a knit 2 together as the last 2 stitches. So to avoid this and similar problems, simply shuffle stitches around by knitting 2 or more stitches from the new needle before changing needles. So I finished this needle, and normally I would pick up the 5th needle and continue knitting. Instead, I knit 2 more stitches, and only then do I pick up my new needle. Then I knit all these stitches here. This frees this needle. I set it to the side, and then I knit 2 more stitches from this needle, pick up the new needle, and so on, and thereby you can shuffle stitches around so you don't end up knitting an SSK or a cable or a color change when knitting in targe and around into these last 2 stitches, because it will look wonky, and trust me, the difference will be so noticeable. Knitting tip number 8. Use a stitch marker to mark the right side. This tip won't make you better at knitting, but it's still super helpful. Sometimes you are knitting a reversible pattern like garter stitch or ribbings, but your pattern still asks you to do certain things only on the right side, for example, increasing. Now, if you're knitting flat and you use the long tail cast on, then you can always use the tail as orientation. If it's on the right side, the tail is on the right side, then you are on the right side. And if the tail is on the left side, you are on the wrong side. So that's kind of easy to remember. But sometimes you are using a different cast on, or the tail is so far below it's very hard to spot. Or you're knitting, for example, a bottom up shawl, and the trick with the tail really doesn't work because there are just 2 stitches here. Well, in these cases you can simply attach a little stitch marker on the wrong side, and you will instantly see which side you are on. Stitch marker wrong side, no stitch marker right side, or the other way around, whatever you prefer. And I feel it's just so very helpful. Knitting tip number 9. Push your needles the right way. Here's a tip for all those of you who are constantly pushing the needles against their fingertips. If you do this very often, especially when you're using really sharp needles, things can get painful. Now, I could spend the next half hour or so trying to show you how to avoid doing that altogether. See, I never push my stitches forward with my fingers. However, there's a really simple trick. Use your knitting needle as a surface instead of your fingertip. So hold your knitting needles like this and then push against the knitting needles. So when you want to push your knitting needles, do it like this. See, I mean, this is really difficult to see because it's hidden, but push like this. And that way you end hurting your fingertips. Push like this.
And we are back in my living room for knitting tip number 10, which is practice. I wanted to conclude this video with a very important tip that might sound like a filler, but is anything but that. Your brain and your muscles, they need time to learn a new technique. For example, if you watch my video here on YouTube on how to knit faster, things might feel awkward at first, and that is normal. You will probably need 10,000 stitches or sometimes even more until things feel even remotely natural. So why do I feel this is so important? Here's the thing. When you started knitting, your first little coaster or pot holder in garter stitch, it probably took you 4 or 8 hours. And well, let's say it looked charming and it had a lot of personality. But you succeeded and you were proud, and you definitely should be, because you just mastered a couple of totally new techniques. But here's the problem. Once you know how to knit, your frustration tolerance is so much lower. No matter if it's knitting in the round on double-pointed knitting needles, trying out a new way to tension your yarn, or even switching from English throwing to continental knitting. there will always be this, thought lurking in your mind saying, well, this is rubbish, it doesn't work, it's so slow, I switch back to my old way of knitting, it's so much better. And of course, why change a running system? But the thing is, if you don't persist, if you don't practice, you will never give your brain and your muscles the time to get accustomed to the new technique, so you will never know if it really is better. Of course, if after practicing it for a couple of hours you notice, well, this still feels a bit awkward, well, then you learned an important lesson and you know which version is better for you. But if you just throw those double-pointed knitting needles into a corner and never look back after just trying it out for 20 minutes, well, that would be a mistake. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed watching and I was able to show you a couple of things you didn't know before. Please like this video to support my work, comment with your questions and your feedback, and of course, consider subscribing to my channel in case you don't want to miss any new videos. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.